Hey, what's going on, DDO players? Axel here. So this video is for brand new players, and the point of this video is to give a general overview of the classes, because I know one of the biggest questions that brand new players have is what class should I play? What race should I play? So I'm going to do a video on classes, which is this video, and there will be another video on races. So the video is just, this video in particular is going to focus on just a general overview of the classes and giving some recommendations of which ones to play, but mostly this video is to just inform new players of how the classes play in DDO and just give them that kind of information to help them decide on their first class. So before we say anything else, we have to say that in DDO, you really should play the class you want to play. In DDO, the classes are very balanced. So I would really encourage you as a player, brand new player, to pick the class that you are most interested in, because the point of the game is to have fun, okay? And any class can work. Okay, the second thing is once you've decided on a class, and we'll go through all of them here in a second, once you've decided on a class, go to the DDO.com forums, and I'll put a link below to a particular thread that shows a lot of different builds, and that'll show you exactly how to build the character. You just follow one of these builds that someone else has put together, and it will make a character for you that's a lot better than the pre-made paths, which we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, another thing to note as far as viability, DDO is not a game that punishes you harshly for dropping difficulty, and DDO offers 14 now. Yeah, 14 different levels of difficulties for most content. So you can always go down if, say, your class can't handle a certain quest, and it's not a big deal. So I wouldn't worry, again, too much about viability of classes. Okay, so let's get into the actual classes themselves. Now, the game, as you can see here, divides the classes into melee, spell, and specialist, and iconic, but really there are three categories: divine, arcane, and melee. That's how I think most players tend to think of the divisions. Now, iconic here, get this out of the way first of all. Iconic is, these are characters that start in the middle of the game. They start at level 15, and DDO currently has 30 levels. There's going to be a level increase probably at the end of 2020, but as of right now, there are 30 levels, and these classes, iconic, start at level 15. They're also all premium, so I wouldn't recommend as a new player you start here, just because you'll be starting in the middle of the game. You'll be missing out on a lot of the stuff you really should experience at the beginning of the game. Particularly a lot of tutorials, and the quests get harder as the game as you gain levels. Quests tend to get harder, so you might be overwhelmed if you start at level 15. Although this option really exists solely so that players can jump into certain content they might buy. So say you buy, for example, like the Shadowfell expansion or the Menace of the Underdark expansion, Iconics exists, so you can jump immediately to that content. But I wouldn't recommend them as a new player. So let's go ahead and start with melee as it's divided here. So let's get into some of these classes. So first thing you'll notice is there's a little indicator here on the right that says solo ability good. For the most part, you should ignore this. It's really not accurate. It's somewhat accurate for some classes, but it's just laughably inaccurate for others. So I would just ignore this for the most part. Okay, so fighters. Let's start with fighters. Now, fighter is a class that I think a lot of new players gravitate to, just because it's the default first option. It also is a class that's usually in most MMOs or any fantasy game, fighter is usually a basic kind of starter class. And in DDO, it's sort of similar in terms of its simplicity. So fighters are very simple to play. They don't get spells. They don't get self-healing. They don't get buffs. They don't get a lot of stuff like that. What they do get is a lot of feats. So feats are basically abilities you can take as you level up, and fighters get a lot more of those. So they're very flexible. You can build them in a lot of different ways. They're very good tanks. They're very good at tactics. So that would be like a fighter who wants to, say, focus on stunning enemies, tripping enemies, doing some crowd control. Now, they can be built in a lot of different ways, but I would say fighter, I think, is actually the worst choice, though, for a new player, just because they don't get any self-healing in their trees. And that's a big deal, especially for a new player. So fighters, at least until you get up to level 20 and get to Epic Destinies, which we'll not talk about in this video, but at least for the first 20 levels or so, fighters don't get any self-healing in their trees. So they're dependent on either using potions, using the UMD skill, use magical device skill to use, say, scrolls to heal themselves, or they're dependent on a party healer or hireling. Now, as a new player, you're going to be flat out broke, so the prospect of buying a lot of scrolls and potions probably is going to be difficult for you as a new player. So that's one reason I would not recommend them. So you're basically, as a new player, if you don't have a lot of money and just starting out, you're going to be dependent probably as a fighter on a hireling or a party member to heal you, and that's just not a good place to be. Self-sufficiency is very important in DDO, so that's why I would shy away from fighter as a first class for a new player. Now, it's not to say fighters aren't a good class. You certainly can build a great fighter tank that's great at high difficulty stuff, build a great tactics fighter, but it's just not the best place to start as a new player. Although no class, as I said before, the classes are pretty balanced. No class is bad. It's just probably the last class I would recommend as a new player. Okay, let's move on to Barbarians. So Barbarians are a little different than fighters in terms of what they can do. So Barbarians wear medium armor, whereas fighters wear heavy armor. Barbarians are a little more offensive focused. They have different trees that are focused on, one that's focused on two-handed fighting, one that's focused on two-weapon fighting. They, unlike fighters, they actually get some self-healing in their trees, not a lot, but a little bit. The problem, though, is this self-healing is not accessible until level 12. It's at the very top of their trees, so tier 5. So you can't access this immediately, so you're going to run into a lot of the same problems that fighters do run into in terms of keeping yourself alive. So that's why I would say Barbarians are probably a little bit better choice than a fighter, but still not a class that I would recommend to new players over others, simply because while they're simple to play, self-healing and self-sufficiency is a big deal in DDO, and it's just not the easiest place to be as a new player. So yeah, that's Barbarians. So let's move on to Paladins. Now, Paladins, I think if you want to build a melee character, Paladin is exactly where you should start. Paladins are an excellent choice for a new player, and I think they are actually the best choice of any class for a new player, just because they are extremely simple to play. They get some very useful buffs, like Death Ward, for example, which is a very good spell in DDO that protects you against insta-death effects, basically. They also get self-healing, so they have some spells. They also get an ability called Lay on Hands that lets them heal themselves, so that's very good. They also get very high saves, which means they're very survivable, and they can wear heavy armor. So saves are basically, if you're not familiar with pen and paper D&D, it's a check against enemy caster's ability. So say the enemy caster casts a hold spell on you, you would go to your will save and do a will save check to see if you are held or not. If your will save is high enough, then you beat the hold and you don't get held. So Paladins have really high saves, so they're much more resistant to things such as crowd control. So that's really nice to have. So definitely I would go with Paladin if you're a new player. I would go two-handed fighting with the Knights of the Chalice tree, which is kind of the offensive Paladin tree, which is more the focus. So I would definitely do that. Paladins aren't going to have as good of offensive ability generally as, say, like a Barbarian, and that's kind of the trade-off for them getting all the survivability. But they're still really great tanks. I think they're pretty good offensive characters as well, offensive melee DPS. So they're really good to play. I would definitely recommend that for a new player. Okay, as you can see here, we're going to get down to Monk now. You can see this little unlock icon. So Monk is one of the premium classes. And you know what? I think I'm going to actually go through the free classes first, but Monk we'll talk about in a little bit. Let's just go ahead and go to the other free classes, because as a new player, you're probably not going to pay to unlock these classes, but there are a lot available to you as a new player. So let's go back here, go to spell. We'll talk about these three free caster classes. So the next kind of category here is casters. So Sorcerer. Sorcerer is a really great choice if you are a new player and you want to play an offensive caster. They're a really, really strong class. One of the strongest classes currently in DDO. They are basically the nuking damage class. So if you want a caster that just throws fireballs and lightning bolts and just throws a lot of damage spells and does a lot of damage, this is probably the class for you. So sorcerers are very similar to wizards in a lot of ways. They share most of the same spells. Now, I believe all the same spells. Sorcerers have some advantages over wizards in that they get a lot more spell points. Their downside is they have a much more limited spell selection, so they only get a couple spells per level, whereas wizards can pretty much access anything, any spell, arcane spell, as long as they have a scroll to inscribe it. So sorcerers just have a much more limited spell selection. They also have worse self-healing options than wizards. They have no self-healing in their class unless you play, say, like a construct, like a Warforged. In that case, they can use self-healing spells, repair spells on themselves, but other than that, they don't have self-healing in their trees. They are, however, really good at using UMD to heal themselves with scrolls and such, although this is not as good generally as, say, like a repair spell, because it's slower and it also costs resources, and you have to hold it in your hand, so you can't hold, say, like a scepter that might be increasing your caster ability. So those are some of the downsides to Sorcerer, but if you want just a nuking damage spellcaster, this is really where you want to go. They're fairly simple to play as far as a caster goes. Casters inherently, though, are going to be more complicated to play than melees just because you have so many spell options. But Sorcerer, as I mentioned already, has less than Wizards, so I think this is a good choice. And again, it's a very strong class, and this is an instance where you need to ignore the solo ability. Sorcerers are actually excellent at soloing, so yeah, really good choice, I would say, for a new player. Okay, next is Cleric. So Cleric, actually let's do Wizard first, because Wizards are much more close to Sorcerer than Cleric. So Wizards are another arcane class, so they get arcane spells. Now, Wizards differ in a few areas from Sorcerers in that they get less spell points, and as a class generally, they're more focused, whereas Sorcerers are kind of the damage spell caster class in DDO. Wizards are the DC casting class in DDO. So they tend to focus more and be better at spells that either succeed or fail. So we're talking crowd control spells like holds, like dancing balls, or things such as insta-death spells, so things like Finger of Death. So these are spells that either work or they don't work. Whereas if we're talking damage spells, like you throw a fireball, it could, even if you miss your save, it will still do half damage. But Wizards, really, their niche tends to be these either succeed or fail type spells. So another advantage they have over Sorcerer, a really notable advantage, is they get a lot better self-healing. So they have the Pale Master tree, which turns your character into an undead form. So say like a zombie or a wraith, for example, and you can then heal with negative energy. So that's really good. You get a really good negative healing aura. You have negative healing burst spell. So it's just a lot better self-healing than what Sorcerers get. I would say that Wizards are a pretty good choice for a new player. I think Sorcerer's better. I think one of the more challenging things you have as a Wizard is you really want to have really good DCs, so you want to have really good intelligence score and have a really high check on your spells, because that way you're not just failing your spells all the time. So it can be really frustrating as a Wizard if you don't have high enough intelligence, a high enough DC on, say, your necromancy spells, where you're in a quest and every time you cast Finger of Death, it's just the mobs are just fortitude saving on it every single time. So as a Wizard, you might reach a point where you can't really do certain content because you're just not effective at all, because your spells just won't land. So I would say Wizards are probably a little bit less good than Sorcerers in that regard for a first life, just because you're gonna struggle more, I think, in, say, like Reaper difficulty if you want to jump into those difficulties on first life. Although Wizards can certainly get really good DCs in hard and elite. I've run a first life Wizard all the way through elite, running elite almost the whole way, and didn't have any problems with my spells landing. So if you build them right, you can certainly have really good success on your spells first life. Okay, let's jump to Cleric now. Now Cleric is it's the only free-to-play kind of caster divine class, although Paladins are also a divine class, but Cleric is there isn't really a healing class in DDO, because every class in DDO is very capable of killing things, but Clerics are the most healing focused of any class in DDO. They can also be pretty good offensive nukers or DC casters, but not as good as Sorcerers and Wizards generally. But they can also be pretty good melees as well, but not as good as, say, like Barbarians, the more true melee classes in terms of DPS. Some advantages they have is they can wear heavy armor. also the divine equivalent of wizards, in the sense that they get a lot of spell selection but fewer spell points than say Favored Soul, which is not a free to play class, which is kind of the sorcerer equivalent, to divine equivalent to sorcerers essentially. They share the same advantages in a lot of ways that say sorcerers have over wizards. So what else? So with clerics, I think I already mentioned they can wear heavy armor, and they get just all kinds of buffs because they're a support class. They get tons of self-healing, tons of buffs. So they're very, very self-sufficient. So with that in mind, it makes them a very good choice for a first life for a new player. One of the downsides I would say is not really a strength weakness type downside. It's more of a social one in game. As a cleric, you're going to be expected in a lot of situations to be healing people. So if you plan on playing in public groups, just be aware that there is kind of an expectation that you at least heal other people a little bit. So if you don't want to play support at all, I would recommend you probably stay away from cleric and instead go for a sorcerer or a wizard. If you just want to build a character that's just going to blow stuff up or kill things, and you don't want to do any kind of support and have no interest in it. Okay, so let's move on now to next free-to-play class, and again, we'll be going back and talking about the paid ones here in a minute. But let's go ahead and go to the next free-to-play class, Ranger. Okay, Ranger is another good beginner choice. They get some useful self-healing spells like Paladins do, and some useful buffs as well. The Ranger class is focused on either fighting with a bow or two-weapon fighting, so fighting with two weapons. And you can kind of pick which one you want to go after. There's a Tempest tree within Ranger, which is the two-weapon fighting tree, and then there's like Arcane Archer, which is kind of the bow-focused tree. There's also Deepwood Sniper tree. So if you want to go with a bow and you're a new player and you're limited to the free classes, this is your best option, I would say. Other classes certainly can be built, so like monk or fighter can be used to build a bow as well, but those are more advanced builds, whereas rangers are kind of the default bow class, I would say. So yeah, ranger, definitely a good solid choice if you're interested in that. I know ranger is a very popular class for a lot of new players as well. Okay, let's go on to rogue. So rogues are kind of the one of two trapper classes, the other being artificer, which is paid. One of the two classes in DDO that can disarm traps. So one thing to note is that traps in DDO, you don't have to have a trapper in your party. It's certainly very nice to have a trapper, but for the most part, with a few exceptions, the content in DDO is made so that you can get around the traps if you don't have a trapper. So it's not a requirement to have a trapper, but it's certainly very nice. You can also get XP bonuses for traps that are disarmed, things like that. So rogues are very nice to have. They're very good melee characters as well, and can be very good range characters. There's the mechanic tree, which focuses on crossbows as well. They get evasion and are really good at avoiding attacks, so evasion lets them avoid a lot of damage that other classes that wear heavy armor would otherwise take. And a lot of their damage is in the form of backstabbing, which requires the rogue to not have aggro. So for that reason, I would say shy away from this class if you want to solo mostly, because if you're soloing, you're obviously always going to have the aggro, so you're not going to get your backstabbing damage. Now, it's not to say you can't solo as a rogue. You certainly can, but it's just not what I would say is the best option, especially for a first-time player. They also don't get any spells inherently, but they're really good at using the UMD skill, so you shouldn't have too many problems as a rogue healing yourselves with, say, scrolls, healing scrolls and such. Although if you're a new player, you're not going to have a lot of money, so that would also be a consideration. You might be pretty reliant on a healer if you don't have a lot of platinum to buy that stuff. But for a new player, it's not a bad choice. I would say there are better choices, but it's a fine choice. Okay, let's go to Bard. So Bard is really kind of an outlier class. They're very unique. They're kind of a jack of all trades but master of none type class, except for buffing. They are probably the best buffing class in the game, I would say. They get a lot of really unique buffs. They're very much focused on support. They can be really good healers, but where they really excel again is buffing. So if you want to play kind of a support character, but you don't want to be a healer, this is probably a good choice for you, because they really focus on playing songs with their little guitar, as you can see here, and buffing allies that way. They also get some really good healing spells. So I would say overall, they're a decent choice for a new player. Now, the downside of all this versatility is they're not as good in general offensive casters or melee as, say, the true melee classes or the true caster classes, but they can certainly be very good casters or melees. Let's see. I think that's about all for bards. And actually, that is going to be it for the new classes, or for the free classes. So overall, I would say here's my pick for the free-to-play classes, the best choice to the worst choice. And you have to note on here, I didn't put bad choice because I don't think there's any classes that are a bad choice for new players. Just some are going to give you a little bit more, a little bit less of a hard time than others. So Paladin, you're going to get a lot more stuff inherently than Fighter. That's going to really help you along the way, especially the first 5-10 levels or so. Okay, so let's jump now into the paid stuff. So if you're not going to buy any paid stuff and you have no interest in learning about these other classes, you can stop the video now. But for those of you that are interested, we're going to move on to the other classes. So let's go back to melee and let's go to monk. Okay, and as you can see here, I own a lot of these classes, but for the purposes of this video, I have created a new account just to show you which classes are free and which ones are not. All right, so monk. Monk are melees that have evasion similar to rogues, so they're very good at avoiding damage. They wear robes. They have a lot of intricacies about them. They're a pretty complex melee class, so they have an ability called Key, which they use for various monk abilities. They have to focus on being centered or not, so they have some restrictions in terms of what they can wear and even what alignment they can be. So monks have to be lawful, for example. They have various stances, so like mountain stance, for example, just various stances that you can choose to pick, what abilities you really want to focus on as your monk and what boosts you want to get. And those stances require you to be centered, so that means you can't wear, say, heavy armor, for example. So monks are, they're a good DPS melee class, but they're kind of, if you have interest in these type of characters that fight with, again, they usually fight with hand wraps, so no weapons, but they can also do other things, so use like a quarterstaff or a bow. But if you're interested in this kind of play style, they're for you, but they're not really a class I would say that a new player would probably want to play, just because they're much more complicated. If you want to play a melee class, again, I would say go Paladin, First Life. But monks are a very good class. Okay, let's move on to the spellcaster classes I didn't hit. So favored souls, as I mentioned before, what sorcerers are to wizards, favored souls are to clerics. So favored souls, they get more spell points than clerics, but less spell selection. The class itself is focused, I would say, a little bit more towards offensive casting than clerics, but they're also really good healers, just like clerics. I would say clerics are probably a little bit better healers, whereas favored souls are a little bit better offensive casters. Favored souls do get a healing tree, though, just like clerics do, so they can be really great at whatever you want them to be, casters or healers, or even melees. They get the war soul tree is a melee option for you. But again, they're not going to be as good as killing things with offensive spells generally, or with melee weapons as, say, the more melee classes. So if you want to sacrifice some of your offensive ability for a little bit of healing and support, then favored soul might be a good option for you. So if you want to play, like, say you want to play a sorcerer, but you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of your offensive ability for, some healing ability to heal your allies, then hey, favored soul is probably a good choice for you. Okay, next to Druid. So Druid is very flexible. They can be focused on melee tanking or offensive casting, so they can even morph into various animal forms. So their melee form is wolf form, so you can turn to a wolf. Their tanking form is bear form, where you can turn to a bear. And they have various elemental forms if you want to focus on, say, being an offensive caster. So you can kind of do whatever you want with Druid. It's probably the class I'm least familiar with, and it's one of the few classes I've actually not played at all. So take my opinion with a grain of salt. But from what I've seen in game and what I've read about them and such, they really can excel wherever you want them to. So Warlock. Okay, Warlock is kind of a hybrid between a offensive caster and say like a bow user or a ranger. They're kind of in the middle there. They are very much a they're very SP efficient class, so they get an ability called Eldritch Blast, which is it's a casting ability that doesn't require any spell points, and it can be upgraded through the various enhancement trees. So that's kind of the focus of Warlock, is their Eldritch abilities. I would say they're probably they're a really good class. They're a good choice for a new player, I would say, but again, not one that you're going to have access to immediately. They're not too difficult to play, especially with their Eldritch Blast. You can just kind of spam that, especially at lower levels. When I played my Warlock, I would just spam the Eldritch Blast stuff at lower levels. You don't have to worry too much about spell points. Pretty easy casting class, I would say. One of the easier ones to play. Okay, next, let's move on to... let's go to Specialist here, and let's move on to Artificer. So Artificer, other than Rogues, is the only other class that can disarm traps. Now, Artificers, unlike Rogues, do not get evasion, so they might have a little bit more difficulty than Rogues going through traps because they can't evade the traps as well. Thematically, they're kind of scientists, the scientist type class of DDO, along with Alchemist, which we'll talk in a minute. But they focus on repeating crossbows. You can also build them for melee, but inherently they focus on repeating crossbows. And they have a rune arm, which is this thing you can see here, this kind of gold blue thing, which is a unique item type to this class specifically that no other class can wear. So you have to be an Artificer to use a rune arm. And you can use some... The use of the rune arm is basically to cast certain spells and gain other certain abilities through playing, through using it. And also it's another inventory slot where you can get some nice boosts to your character stats and such on it. This class can be unlocked in House Cannith with House Cannith favor in game. And I actually didn't know, I didn't mention this before, but favored souls can also be unlocked in game with favor. Okay, let's go. Oh, Artificer, by the way, I would say a really good choice for a new player. They have a lot of flexibility, especially if you play a Warforged Artificer. You can heal yourself with repair spells, and they can get traps. They can do good range damage, so they're quite a good choice for a new player. Okay, Alchemist. Alchemist is DDO's newest class. It just came out this past year. And it's a class I would not recommend for a new player, as they're very complicated. And I did a whole video kind of explaining the basics of Alchemist, which I'll link below if you're interested. But they are focused on creating and throwing potions, and also throwing like range weapons and inflicting poison damage. They have a very unique reaction system, which basically means that you get certain bonuses for casting spells in a certain order. So because of that, they're quite complicated, one of the more complicated classes in DDO, so I definitely wouldn't recommend them for new players. They also have their own unique spell list. So they're a very, very unique class, and a really cool class, but not one that I would recommend at all for new players. So yeah, guys, that's going to be it for this video. But again, bottom line here is play the class you want to play. Play the class you're most interested in. The classes are very balanced in DDO. So I wouldn't stress too much about, say, if you have no interest in Paladin, you don't have to play Paladin, just because I said that's the best choice first life, in my opinion, for a new player. Play what you want to play. You can make it work, but hope this video just made you aware of which classes are maybe a better choice than others for first life, your first experience. And again, one thing I also want to emphasize here is that the path option here, never go with any of these three options. These are basically options that pick your character for you, pick your character's stats and feats for you, and they create very weak characters because they're just old and haven't been updated. So always go with customize, and always follow a build again that is from the DDO forums. I will put a link below again to for you all to go and look at, so you can look at a build and definitely pick a build instead of going through the paths. The only way I would say to use the paths is if you are, say you just want to jump into the game and just play a few levels and just see it and experience it for an evening, then maybe they're okay. Just be aware that you're probably going to want to at some point re-roll your character if you go with these pre-made paths for any of the classes, because they're not good. So yeah, guys, that's going to be it for this video. There will be another video on races, but that's going to be it for this one for classes. Have a good one. Take care.